coming today. I thought we all needed like a very nice talk with someone in the room after yesterday's kind of letdown. So we have the pleasure to have here Dr. Renata Ntelia, who holds a PhD in games from the Institute of Digital Games, University of Malta. She currently works as an assistant professor of games at the School of Computer Science at the University of Lincoln in the UK. And her research focuses on love within the context of human-computer interaction, death and the macabre, I love it, and experimental game design, mostly about historical trauma. Outside academia, she's also worked as a games translator and a game writer. Today, she's going to talk about love and romance in games from a phenomenology perspective. And I love that she's going to talk about love on a Friday, doesn't it? Especially the topic, I found it very interesting. I can't wait to hear more about it. She's going to give her talk, obviously, and then we'll have a bit of a Q&A session. The volunteers will be passing the microphone around, so if you have any particular questions for her, she will address them very happily. So thank you very much, Renata.
Hi, thank you so much. Can you all hear me? Yeah, great. So yeah.
Let's just bring it a bit closer. Or maybe if we put it here.
Is this better? Great, thank you. So yeah, hello. Thank you so much for being here. I know it's the last day of the conference and it's quite early, so I'm sure you're all tired. I hope I won't tire you more. And thank you to Tigra for inviting me to be a keynote. I'm very, very excited and honored about this. As Irene very nicely introduced me, my name is Renata Ntelia. I'm a lecturer of games with the School of Computer Science, University of Lincoln, and I mostly research love within the context of human-computer interaction and other academic interests. But today, I'm specifically going to talk about love in games, and I'm going to ask the question of what is love, a question I'm sure we'll be able to answer within the hour. And this question is addressed, and what I'm going to present today is mostly inspired my PhD, which is about love in games as experience and representation. A bit of a disclaimer, my focus is predominantly romantic love, so this is what I'm going to mostly be talking about, and also most of my examples will be about romantic love, but my speech doesn't exclude other types of love. So to start with, I would like to show some ways that love can feature in games, and this, if we say list, is not exhaustive by any means, and there are many more ways or other fashions and facets that love can be included in games. So the first one is love as a game. So games that depict love as abstract, as a simulation or a metaphor even. We have Marriage by Rod Humble, a 2010 game, in which you control two squares and you have to negotiate space and needs within this framework. As an answer to that game, we have My Divorce by Brett Deville in 2010 again. And we also have other games like Will Love Tear Us Apart by Mighty Box in 2013. Again, a game that shows what happens once love leaves and how do you negotiate departure. And other games like Online Dating, 2014, which is a simple game about online dating, very hard, on which I may or may have not spent very many hours while doing my PhD for research purposes. So another category is love between NPCs, and here we're talking about narratives that don't include the player as a character at all. For example, Love Conquers All Games, published, which is the company of Kristin Love, a designer predominantly interested and that has worked in games and love. Published Don't Take It Personally, Baby, Just in Your Story. It follows a high school teacher who manages to follow romantic relationships of his students, but the game doesn't involve his love story, or if it does, it's only a very small part. Gone Home, another game in which the main character uncovers a story and doesn't participate in the story, in the love story themselves. And To the Moon is another game where, again, the playable characters uncover a story that has already happened, has already taken place. And finally, not finally, another category is love between players. These are games where are multiplayer, usually online, and people come together, play the game, and maybe they'll form relationships, friendly relationships, or romantic relationships. World of Warcraft is a very prominent example. And it's interesting because players who have fallen in love in World of Warcraft have described the experience as something that happened because of the game. So it wasn't just a happenstance that two people came together in a social context. It's because of how people reacted as players that inspired love and affection between any two people or more. And Sibel is another game. It's not multiplayer online, but instead it portrays a relationship between two players that fell in love while playing an online game. So as we can see here, Sibel is an apt example that shows that all these different ways that love can feature in games, and it can be afforded in more ways than one. Sibel is not a multiplayer game, but it is a very good way to see how a multiplayer falling in love story between two players could have been experienced. And now, finally, we have love between player and NPC. It's probably the most common way love features in games. We have a very rudimentary love story that takes place in cutscenes, like in Tomb Raider, Angel of Darkness, between Lara and Curtis. We might have some interactivity. For example, in Heavy Rain, you can choose partially how the love story progresses. We can have games like Laser Street Larry, in which the love is also thematic, so it inspires the rationale of the game, and all the game actions involve around love and sex. And here, especially, we have a mini game which the player needs to successfully play, and as long as they do it successfully, Larry, who here is the nephew of original Larry, can continue talking to that girl. We have other games like Dragon Age, very popular romantic mechanics, in which you can choose through dialogue options to have romance. Dream Daddy, as an example of dating sims, a very prominent genre of love and relationships. And also games like Sims, they're not that many, but where love is part of a whole simulation and the whole simulated experience. And personally, and also epistemologically, I'm very interested in the question of, is there actually love in games? We've seen all these examples, but if love is abstract simulation between NPCs, or we have a love story between two human players falling in love, things are not as complicated. But what about games like the last category, where we have a human player falling in love with a computer-generated character? I think this is the context where most tensions rise, because we have an entity which is human and human being and has human needs as we understand them, and something beyond humanness, which might actually imply the question, can we love artificial humans? Is there a possibility to do that? And I want you to take a minute and consider yourselves, through your own media and game history, whether this is possible. I would like you to ask yourselves, have I ever loved a character? Have you ever felt an emotional attachment with a character? It's something that many people have discussed online. And here we have an account from a Reddit user who was answering to the question, who was your first crush? And the answer is, it was Cookie from Animal Crossing for GameCube. I used to bring her flowers and fossils and talk to her over and over until she told me to go away. Then one day she said she didn't want to lose me, and a heart emoticon floated above her head. And I knew it was real. So I sent her a love letter. Then a few weeks later, I had a friend over and we traveled to each other's towns. A few days later, I opened my mailbox and saw a letter from Cookie. She told me that she had moved. She moved to my friend's town. I was heartbroken and planted flowers where her house once stood. Then the next week at school, I walked into my class and everyone started laughing at me. Cookie had showed my friend the letter I wrote to her. She showed him the letter. I had never felt more betrayed in my entire life. I couldn't believe that she did that to me. So when I got home, I ripped up all the flowers I planted in her memory and vowed to never love again. I see past your fake smile, you cold-hearted bitch. It's obvious that for this person, Cookie is very much real. And it might look silly to us as adults, but it's important to take into consideration that, especially for generations younger than me, so later than the early 90s, their first interaction and attachment to another being is very possible to happen within a game. So getting rejected by a digital character for a child could be very much real, and the feelings of heartbreak and rejection are also very much real. Also, I've been conducting this research, which is still running, so if you could participate, if you haven't already, I would very much appreciate it. And here's some very preliminary data. So as of now, I have around 293 answers, and as you can see, the predominant answer to the question if you've ever felt an emotional attachment to a character in a video game is yes. And this attachment is mostly described as friendly, with 109 answers. But romantic is not that far behind, with 92. And the next question, have you ever experienced romantic feelings, increases the percentage, because this question is only applied to people who answered not romantic in the previous question. So we have an increase in how many players have felt romantically towards a character. So it already shows that this is an important question that affects many people, and not only their play and gameplay, but their lives in general. So my question then becomes, how can we fall in love with fictional or artificial others? We know that we can have some feelings, but how is that possible in terms of both phenomenology and cognition and biology? We're human beings, biological beings. How can we fall in love with something that is not real? And my trail of thought goes to humans can and do love non-human beings like their pets and plants, or even inanimate objects like their cats and personal cars and personal collections. But does the player's attachment to digital or fictional character work or function on the same principle? Because non-human beings are still part of our physical world, but what about beings that are not part of our physical world anymore? To answer to that question, I draw from the discipline of embodied perception and phenomenology. I've published a chapter about it if you want to read more on the topic. But basically what happens is that the space that engulfs our bodies, the space where we can act and see the results of our actions, is called peripersonal space. It's different to the abstract geometrical space of Cartesian and Euclidean coordinates. In that peripersonal space, our perception depends on our bodies. It's embodied. How our bodies react and act within this space and how they become subjects and objects of affects. So we perceive the space of digital games as our peripersonal space, even though it is not physical space anymore, because it can allow our actions, it can afford our enactment and intentional actions. Embodied perception is also equally responsible for our perceiving and understanding other agents within our peripersonal space as intentional beings. When we see someone performing an action, what happens is that a similar motor schema within our brains gets activated. So when we see someone performing an action, it's as if we are performing this action. And the next step is that we apply also intentions, and we perceive these agents as volitional, because we have already made the connection that if it were ourselves performing this action, it would have been with a purpose. So the other agent performing in the same way as we do should also have intentions and volitions. So attaching oneself to a non-human has nothing to do with their ontology, but with our perception of them. It is all about how we perceive the others. We can't conceive their ontology. We can only understand how they are by relating them to ourselves. We recognize as embodied agents an agent that manipulates their bodies in a similar fashion as we do, no matter if this agent serves our ontology. And there is also an interspecies embodied perception, which means that if a being that is not a human being performs an action that is similar to our own performativity, we still perceive it as an intentional agent. Research has shown that when we see a dog or a monkey eat, our motor schemas are also activated and triggered because they perform an action that is very similar to how we perform. But if we see a dog bark or a monkey smack their lips, we don't have a similar activation, exactly because we don't have this motor schema ourselves. So the lack of physicality itself does not affect our perception by default. Our brains, studies have shown, do not differentiate between materialities. When we play a video game, our brains transform figures on a flat screen to embodied characters. And this is true even when we perceive their emotions and not just their actions. Obviously, it's not automatic. The more anthropomorphic a character is, the better we perceive them as a human being. It is also a matter of consistency. If they consistently behave human-like, our perception of them as human-like remains very high. But as I said, this also happens with emotions and not just actions. When we see someone crying, we attribute specific feelings that this person might feel because we have associated feelings of, with this action when we cry. And here, for example, we have some faces. So what do you think the person on the top left is feeling? Any guesses? Skeptical. Close, close. Any other guesses? It could be. It could be, actually. It's contempt. Yeah. What do you think the top right? I think that's a bit easier. Yeah, he's smiling. He's happy. Bottom left. Yeah, disappointment, sadness. You feel sad. And bottom right. How would you feel if you saw this face? Very close. Angry, yeah, exactly. He's angry. So as you can see, there are some indications as to what the person is feeling by our perceiving them. And this goes into the theory of basic emotions by Paul Ekman and other theorists. And basically, we have a set of basic emotions that are considered universal, and they are we can identify them much more easily. Joy, surprise, contempt, sadness, disgust, anger, and fear are considered basic emotions. Do you notice anything in this picture? Exactly. Exactly, thank you. There is not a face for love. Love is not a basic emotion, and it does not equate to an ambiguous emotional response. So we already have difficulty making anthropomorphic agents in a different materiality. Love makes things even more complicated because it's not as basic as other emotions. Fear, for example, is very easy to simulate in games. Love is a high-level emotion. It's an experience even, and it's a conglomerate of many different aspects. So how do we design love? We saw that players can get attached to digital characters, but how can we consistently do that with intention and not just have it as a happenstance or a coincidence? How can we guarantee that this experience happens when we design a game? Experiencing love with a digital character is difficult for one